Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Since the beginning of mankind, during the time of the hunter-gatherers, agriculture is what has kept the human race going. And now, as the world struggles to feed a rapidly growing global population of about 7 billion people, it is the agri-sector that is under the spotlight again as the saving grace. But the challenges are many, and in Africa, where heavy-hitting industries such as mining and oil continue to disrupt arable land, the need to address the future of agriculture on the continent is becoming increasingly desperate. Joining us in studio is Zhann Meyer. He's the Africa head for agricultural commodity finance at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Bank. And Melle Leenstra joins us from Nairobi. And Melle is the first Secretary of Food Security and Economic Development at the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Gentlemen, thank you for making the time to join me. Zhann, let's start here and just get you to give us a sense of what are the big issues in the agricultural space right now, the kind of things that are keeping you at Nedbank awake?
I think the major issue for us is actually what's happening right now in South Africa in terms of our grain sector. We are enjoying the all-time high prices on white and yellow maize, but in the same time we are actually seeing an El Nino. We just came out of the worst drought in 23 years in South Africa with a 40% drop in our maize crop. And it's an issue because for the first time in 7 years, South Africa is actually importing maize, which is our staple food, rather than exporting to our neighboring countries. And I think that's an issue for all commercial farmers as well as sustainable farmers in South Africa.
So do we connect that back to climate change broadly and saying this is where this stems from?
Unfortunately, we have to. I think the frequency and intensity of these type of events is much more than a cycle. I think we have to say to ourselves that global warming is here to stay. It's a risk that we need to understand and a risk that we need to keep on mitigating. And that's not only South Africa, it's actually an African phenomenon, if not global.
Melle, perhaps let's get you just to weigh in on some of the comments that Zhann has made. He says global warming is not about to go away, it is here to stay. Do you get a sense that the various African governments, and in particular the one that you're engaging with now in Kenya, has really begun to understand the need to make sure that we have the right strategies to mitigate the impact of climate change on the agricultural sector?
Well, the key for agricultural development in this part of the world is to have good focused agricultural entrepreneurship. And the challenge is on governments to create an enabling environment to allow farmers to make the decision decisions that are important to them, to engage in farming as a business. The situation in South Africa is a bit different than elsewhere on the continent. South Africa, you have large-scale commercial farms that are dominating the agricultural sector. In the rest of Africa, we have a lot of small-scale farmers who are engaging in farming as a part-time pastime activity. For Kenya, you need to make that change from farming as a part-time pastime activity to farming as a business. So we as an embassy, we believe that medium-sized, commercially oriented family farms are the most sustainable way of feeding Africa and feeding the nation. And we see some positive examples of the Kenyan government here supporting farmers to engage in farming as a business.
Melle, I just want to stay with you with that idea and the transition from subsistence farming to commercial farming. Are the development finance institutions and even the traditional banks coming to the party to fund agri-entrepreneurship so that we do actually have an investment into those pieces of land and into that agricultural activity to make it as viable as possible?
Well, there are international funds coming in. A lot of development banks, such as FMO, the Dutch Development Bank, but also IFC with the global program for food security and agriculture. They are very much interested in funding agriculture. But the challenge is finding investable business, bankable business to work with. There's a lot of agribusiness. The agribusiness space is moving here in Kenya. But the challenge is at the farmer level, medium-sized farmers that are farming as a business, SME farmers that are farming as a business. We as a Dutch government, we're investing in that space. not as donors as such, but as social investors, because we also see a Dutch interest there. The Netherlands has a lot of expertise and technology in the area of agriculture, but to be able to close the technology gap, we have to invest in capacity along the value chain, in horticulture, in dairy, in potatoes and in aquaculture. And that is what we're doing as an embassy together with partners like the Equity Group Foundation.
I think you raise a very important issue around the integration of technology into the agricultural space, and we'll pick up on that in a moment. Zhann, I want to come back to the money behind agriculture, because on the one hand, does it make sense to invest in the commodities markets right now? We know what commodities look like, and agricultural commodities, are they any better or any worse than some of the other mining commodities that are currently under pressure now? What do investors want that they're not seemingly getting if investment still has a deficit that needs to be filled?
If we want to categorize agricultural commodities as an investment class, that's a whole new different topic. And I think for the time being, if one look just at SAFEX, the South African Futures Exchange, and what that has shown us on the maize price, for instance, is a more than 70% increase in the white maize price year on year. And that purely is derived from the fact that we've suddenly become a net importer of maize as opposed to a net exporter last year. So to purely go and speculate on a maize market is something for a very brave investor. I think most of the market at this point in time on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, in terms of the SAFEX portion of it, is used for hedging. And it's basically just used to manage balance sheet risks, to manage and hedge your price risk prior to or during the harvest. And that's a tool, it's not a toy.
There's a very good phrase that I've often heard around agricultural commodities, and they say, don't put your money in there because that's like betting against God. Now, I want to get your reaction to that, because it certainly seems that with the play of global markets setting the prices, and then you've also got the environmental factors that come into being. I want you to bring Mel's idea of infusing technology to better manage God and to better manage the environment. Can that actually come together?
You mentioned a formidable betting partner there. I don't think I'm going to take my odds on that one. But I think there's enough tools in the market to make sure that to gamble with your balance sheet is not necessary. In terms of taking on the weather, that's something that every farmer needs to just accept and make the best of. And the way you make the best of that is rightly, as you say, is to adopt technology. To embrace what precision farming can give us in terms of soil management, making sure our chemical composition in the soil is right, making sure we farm sustainably for the next generation, making sure we actually employ no-till or minimum till on our soils to engage and maintain our moisture levels. And all those things, I think, as Melle rightly said, is open to commercial farmers. And we've got about 32,000 of them in South Africa, and these guys farm on a mechanized commercial basis. And just to draw the analogy, and I agree totally with Melle, is we've got 2.8 million small households in South Africa involved in agriculture in some or other way. And the last census showed that 92% of them actually make agriculture their way of living. These are subsistence farmers. I'll come back to finance. If you don't own the land, which is more often the case than not on the African continent, and you can't give that land as collateral for a loan, it's very difficult to finance that farmer if you look at crop being the intrinsic value of the crop being the collateral for the loan. If I'm a farmer and a family and I'm going to tell you at the onset that I'm going to eat your collateral, it's a very difficult conversation to have with a commercial bank.
I think, Zhann, you raise an important point around land tenure models and what has worked and what we can learn. But I just want to quickly go back just to stay with one last point, Melle, around the flow of funds into agriculture. What was your insights around the extent to which governments are leading the way in terms of investing in the agricultural space as a means of enticing the private sector and reducing the kind of risk that private sector investment would otherwise want to shy away from?
Well, there's a lot of private sector investment in the Kenyan agricultural space, and there are a lot of banks rearing to lend to farmers. The Equity Bank is a first mover in Kenya. Chase Bank is a fast mover in Kenya, very eager to work with farmers, to find programs to lend to farmers. Financing is very important, but in the situation that Kenya and countries here in the region have, of an inflation rate of around pushing 10% and a central bank rate around that, necessarily the cost of capital is very high. So loan-driven agricultural development has its weaknesses, because then a farmer really has to have a very high return to be able to not just work for the bank but also earn something out of it. So what we are working on with some of our partners is promoting farmers to really do good record keeping, to know where their binding constraints are, to reinvest into their farm, because a lot of farmers on the continent are in agriculture just to earn a living, and they don't tend to reinvest in agriculture in the way that they should, to even maintain their soil fertility, leave alone be active players in the market rather than victims of market forces.
Zhann, Melle, rather very interesting points there around models around commercial farmers and smallholder farmers in particular. I think to tie the two threads together, I want to come back to the point that you raised earlier, Zhann, and this is around land tenure. Are there land tenure models that we've seen on the continent that can be replicated, where we say in this particular market they're getting it right and it is actually working in favor of the smallholder farmer and improving their credit worthiness so that they can access the finance?
I think it's a wider topic than that, but to talk about land ownership, generally in Africa, land ownership to commercial farmers is not an availability. It's a long-term lease, and that lease can then obviously be ceded if it's a proper security. And some banks use that as security to make sure that, yes, I can't sell the land, but at least I know the farmer's going to be on there for the next 5-6 years. So what Melle said is critically important, is to make sure that I see public and private sector as a partnership in these ventures. And maybe governments and developmental financial organizations come to the party by putting in the long-term capital, the capex, putting in mezzanine capital, putting in a first loss of some sort to enable commercial banks to come in on the back of that and fund the production cost. Now, for me, a model that we've seen working over and over is a spoke and hub model, where we would have a central mechanized farming operation, being that a corporate or being at an agricultural cooperative, joining forces, making sure that this is the model for farming in the region. And I surely am not one of the believers that commercial agriculture is the solution for Africa. You cannot urbanize, 60% of the African continent's people that's currently involved in agriculture. It's just not viable. So the spoke and hub model for me is something that works, where the hub actually provides a number of things to outgrowers in the region. And those things are things like technology, training, skills upliftment. It's things like storage for their crop. It's a market which is critical for actually selling your crop and making it a commercially viable thing. And then also mechanization.
Mechanization and adopting a spoke and hub approach in the agricultural space. These are some of the ideas that are being put on the table. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we pick up some of these ideas and we extend the conversation around agriculture on the African continent. We'll see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back to Invest Africa. Still with me in the Johannesburg studio is Zhann Meyer. He's the Africa head for agricultural commodity finance at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Bank. And Melle Leenstra still joins us. He's the first secretary of food security and economic development at the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And he joins us from Nairobi. Melle, let me start off with you before we get into the conversation. I just want to touch on food security and whether this is a myth or reality that we should be concerned that, given the growing population numbers and the demographic boom expected on the African continent, that food security is a real risk that we could be facing.
Food security, feeding the African population is a great opportunity. The population is growing, the population is, the middle class is growing. There's a larger demand for food and a larger demand for high quality food. At the same time, agricultural productivity in large parts of the continent is far lower than what would be possible. So that creates opportunities for intensification, for increasing production, for investing in agricultural productivity, and feeding this growing middle class population. that is what we're looking at. But if Africa wants to feed itself and wants to feed the rest of the world, or parts of the rest of the world, then the approach to agriculture should be shifted from semi-subsistence smallholder to holding to farming as a business. And I think that's a great opportunity. In Kenya, you really see the buzz and the dynamics around that. You see young people getting interested in agriculture again. Whereas for a long time it was a pastime for the ones who were left behind. You see that tech-savvy young Kenyans are developing interesting business cases for agriculture. So I don't think that food security is a challenge. Food security is an opportunity, and an opportunity that both Kenyans as well as international partners can profit from.
So an opportunity and not a challenge, and that's a different perspective which Melle is suggesting that we look at this. But let's perhaps talk of one of the best practice examples we've seen on the continent. Nigeria has done extremely well. If we just look at their rice production, for example, that's really done a turnaround. Just give us a sense of what should we be extrapolating from this success story that could be replicated, Zhann, in other markets?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is Minister Adesina's phenomenal leadership.
Absolutely.
And the way he turned around the look at agriculture and saying that, I realize only 11% of the farmers actually physically get their fertilizer in time. He changed that by technology. He actually physically registered 14.5 million farmers on cell phones and got their inputs to them on time 95% of the time. Now, in doing that, he increased the food production in the last 3 years in Nigeria by 21 million tons. Now, that shows you what can be done. But I think it starts with leadership, and it starts with the willingness of a government to actually engage and assist in making these things happen.
And it also takes people at the center of the Zhann, and your assessment of whether the African continent has the skills to really drive a competitive agricultural industry.
We talk about 600 million hectares of arable land in Africa, and that's available at the moment. So that's 60% of arable land in the world globally. It's not being used. The skills that are employed today in most African countries, and that's why we need to be thankful for people like Melle and his initiatives to actually uplift these people, are probably decades old, if not centuries old. So to uplift these people, not only in terms of technology, but also in terms of sustainable farming methodology is a crucial challenge. Just to make sure that the best seeds are used, the best fertilizer is applied at the right time. And then also, I think crucially, Nancy, is the fact that it needs to be sustainable. Soil degradation in Africa is a major issue for us in terms of erosion, and that obviously makes soil unusable for the next season. So what we find is that a bush is getting burnt down, it's used for agriculture for 2 or 3 years, the soil is mined, and then the farmers move on. And that soil, it takes a very, very long time to actually get back to its original state. And that's where the skills and the transfer of knowledge comes in, to make sure that those farmers use the land and actually just, almost lend it from their kids.
Melle, a couple of issues on sustainability that Zhann raises here in Johannesburg. I perhaps want to just put on the table the issue of water and whether we're thinking about this in parallel to the broader conversation around agriculture. Water scarcity becoming a real concern on the African continent. How do you think we should best approach this dual problem at this point?
No, Zhann is completely right. Soil fertility is under pressure, is under threat. For too long, farmers have been soil nutrient mining by growing maize year in, year out, with not exactly the right fertilizers being applied to the land. For an area like Uasin Gishu, the area around Eldoret and Kitale in Kenya, for example, wonderful land, expansive land. We still have quite a lot of farmers who have relatively large plots, but they're abusing that land for just growing maize year after year. We see that a lot more could be done with that land if they have a sustainable rotation of various crops. If on that land, for instance, there are a lot of dairy farmers there, if they grow forage crops, if they plant potatoes, if they grow oil seeds, the cake of which can be used for the dairy industry, and the oil of which companies like Bidco are crying for a good, sustainable supply of oil. If we have rotation systems, mixed farming rotation systems that make agronomic sense and marketing sense, then we can really do a lot with the land that's there. But the most important thing is that farmers should see their land as an asset first and foremost. An asset to be invested in by integrated soil fertility management, organic fertilizers, inorganic fertilizers, and good farming practice to tend to the health of the land. The problem here in Kenya is that a lot of people want to own land, but a lot of people are not too interested in farming. So plot sizes are decreasing, and that's why the idea of medium-sized family farms, husbands and wives working together on the land and having a succession plan so that one of their children can take over the land, not subdividing it when the next generation has its turn, but tending to the land, making sure that you have a family farm that could stand for generations. That's what made farming great in the Netherlands, and that is also the vision that, together with partners here in Kenya, we're trying to reach for here in Kenya.
But Zhann, just drawing from the comments that Melle makes around land is very politicized on the African continent, especially when it comes to investing at a very high level and at large scale. Are we getting towards depoliticization of land, where it's really been seen as an asset and not something that's at risk of being taken away as a change of government comes about or not?
I think what we've seen in certainly some of the African countries, the answer is unfortunately no. It's still politicized, and it still actually prevents farmers from physically spending capital and making that long-term investment. You touched on water, for instance. Now, the only way to actually physically use water right in a system where water is available, whether it's groundwater or water in dams and reservoirs, is through irrigation. Now, irrigation is a whole different story because it costs a lot of money to put down the infrastructure. And then we talk about extended infrastructure, holding dams, stormwater management, transport, logistics, electricity to drive the pumps. All those things are things that cost money, and it takes 10, 15 years to repay. So insecurity about land tenure and ownership is obviously an issue for a farmer that has a long-term view.
I want to bring a voice that I think we haven't heard from Melle, and maybe Melle, you can come with a comment about this. Given the fact that in the agricultural space, it is women who generally are tending the land and who are behind the large produce that is produced from the agricultural space, are we getting a sense of women beginning to actively participate economically in agriculture in Africa?
Well, it's true. Women are the backbone of the agricultural sector. Women taking care of their children, growing crops to feed their children. Ideally, women and men work together as a family unit, and that I've seen some success stories of that. Women are very good at tending, making sure that everyone takes care of. Husbands very often are risk seekers, look for opportunities. That combination that you have within the family unit is potentially a very strong one. That's why I keep on talking about family businesses, husbands and wife working together, the next generation being groomed to take it over. I've seen wonderful examples of family businesses here in Kenya. Both Kenyan family businesses as well as Dutch Kenyan family businesses or Dutch German family businesses. And it's that partnership between the husband and the wife which has made these family businesses work very well. We in development talk about gender. We very often talk about women empowerment. In Kenya, we also have to make sure that the boy child isn't left behind. I think it's a family business, and by looking at it as a family business, building on the strengths of both men and women, I think that agriculture can really go far.
Well, that's on that note of an emphasis on family businesses where men, women working together to ensure that they are commercializing their farming activities. And of course, remembering really effective ministerial posts like that held by the former Minister of Agriculture of Nigeria, Minister Adesina, and the kind of changes that has brought into that space. Can we replicate that into the rest of the continent? These are just some of the questions that we promise to take forward for you. For now, though, let me say a big thank you to Zhann Meyer, the Africa Head for Agricultural Commodity Finance at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Bank, as well as Melle Leenstra, First Secretary of Food Security and Economic Development at the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and he, of course, joined us from Nairobi. For you at home, if you want to be a part of these conversations, you can certainly do that. All you need to do is just drop us a tweet using the hashtag InvestAfrica, and we will get your investment question addressed on this show. For myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye.
Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.